Would the House please come to order? Members kindly take their seats. Devotions today will be led by the music group Lokum, playing Armenian music. Peter Bingham of Underhill, Jeff Davis of Charlotte, and Charlie Jones of South Burlington. The Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by Emily Haynes of Woodstock.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
We have several resolutions for introduction today. HCR 86 is a House concurrent resolution commemorating the 100th anniversary of the start of the Armenian Genocide. It's offered by Representatives Lenes of Shelburne and Gresham of Warren. Please listen to the reading of the resolution.
Whereas from 1915 to 1923, the government of the Ottoman Empire persecuted and executed systematically an estimated 1.5 million Armenians. And whereas this brutal mistreatment became known as the Armenian Genocide, and by 1923 it had resulted in the elimination of the Armenian population in Asia Minor and historic West Armenia. And whereas the Armenian Genocide began on the night of April 24, 1915, when the Turkish government arrested more than 200 Armenian community leaders in Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire's capital city. And whereas most of the prominent public figures of the Armenian community were summarily executed, and whereas large numbers of Armenian civilians were forcibly deported to the Syrian desert, and many died either en route, at the hands of the government-aligned gangs, or from dehydration and starvation in the desert. And whereas in May 1915, the Allied powers of France, Great Britain, and Russia issued a joint statement charging the government in Constantinople with committing crimes against humanity and civilization, the first time a government-to-government charge of this type was issued. And whereas it is estimated that by 1918, the Ottoman Empire's brutal treatment of Armenians had resulted in the deaths of 1 million persons and made hundreds of thousands of others homeless and stateless refugees. And whereas Raphael Lemkin, the initial drafter of the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and the originator of the term genocide, recognized the Armenian genocide as the type of crime the United Nations should prevent through the establishment of international standards. And whereas historians cite the Armenian genocide as a forerunner of the later human massacres, including the Holocaust, the Cambodian killing fields, Bosnia, Rwanda, and Darfur. And whereas on April 24, 2004, Governor James Douglas issued a proclamation recognizing the Armenian genocide on the 89th anniversary of its initiation. Now therefore be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives that the General Assembly commemorates the 100th anniversary of the start of the Armenian genocide. And be it further resolved that the Secretary of State be directed to send a copy of this resolution to the Armenian National Committee of Vermont.
Now you've heard the reading of the resolution. The question is, shall the House adopt the resolution on its part? Are you ready for that question? If so, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Yes, pretty have it. The ayes do have it, and you have adopted HCR 86.
But I know people are going to be coming in and out of the room, and that's okay. Time restrictions will limit some of our visiting. I'm Representative Joan Lenes of Assyrian descent. My father came over from Persia, and I know Jessica Oski, and she has helped us coordinate Chris Bohjalian and Dana and just want to say thank you to all of you who have come and all of you who have helped organize this. We read a resolution on the floor of the House. The Senate has sponsors on it, just recognizing the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. And Chris and Dana have offerings for us today. Folks have made this amazing Armenian food, desserts. Just bring back all family festivities in our house. So thank you for doing that. And I'll let them take over. And again, in and out, whatever your schedule allows. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. First of all, I'd like to give a huge shout out to Representative Lenes, to Representative Gresham, to our Senate guardian angels, Senator Baruch and Senator Snelling, and to the 14 senators who have co-sponsored the resolution with them. Today is a great day. Today, HRC 86 was unanimously passed. It is the first time that the Vermont Assembly has officially recognized and commemorated the Armenian Genocide. So I am so grateful and so proud to be here. all of you for joining us this afternoon. A huge shout out to my fellow High Tide warrior, Dana Walrath, the immensely gifted writer. She's going to speak for a few minutes after I speak for a few minutes. Yes, this is my license plate. The geography of the Armenian soul meets Vermont. I want to begin with a story that bears directly upon the origins, the structure, and the text of my novel, The Sandcastle Girls, and explains why we are gathered here together today. Behold, my mother and father. My father was Armenian 100%. My mother was Swedish 100%. And while that means in theory that my mother was the outsider at all of the big, wonderful gatherings of the Armenian half of my family, my mother was never the outsider. She adored her Armenian in-laws, and my Armenian grandparents adored their blonde, blue-eyed daughter-in-law. Exhibit A, my mother's keychain. Now you need to know my mother was unbelievably superstitious. She would not leave the house without her keychain. She died years ago. My father died more recently, the summer before The Sandcastle Girls was published. And when I was going through all of the items on my father's dresser with which he had a totemic connection, I came across my mother's keychain, and on it were 3 items: a St. Jude medal, a St. Christopher medal, and a bronze charm of the nation-state of Armenia. Exhibit B. I grew up about 20 minutes from my grandparents in Westchester. On Saturday mornings, when my father was playing golf with his buddies or coaching my older brother's Little League baseball team, my mother would bring me to her in-laws where the 3 adults would have coffee and Armenian pastries and tell stories, and I would listen in quite contentedly. Now, at some point, for reasons that are inexplicable, my mother started having me sing for my grandparents. I say inexplicable because I couldn't sing then, and I certainly cannot sing now. Over the seasons, these concerts grew more elaborate until suddenly my mother was having me sing for the entire Armenian half of my family on Easter, Christmas, and Thanksgiving. Now, you need to know that I was a fat kid. Not morbidly obese, but so heavy that my mother bought me all of my pants at a store in Stamford, Connecticut called Greenberg's Husky Boys Shop. And still, she had to cuff my pants up to my knees. So here's the story. It's Easter Sunday, and I'm 5 years old, and for this gathering at my Armenian grandparents', my mother has dressed me up in a pair of red velvet knickers, no cuffs, and a white turtleneck shirt because she wants me to look British. Why? She's having me sing the Herman's pop classic, I'm Henry VIII I Am. Yep, a fat kid in red velvet knickers singing Herman's with a bad British accent. I ask you, how is it that my Armenian cousins never beat me up? Now, the story is relevant, first of all, because if you've read The Sandcastle Girls, you know this is page 1 of the novel. Secondly, it is relevant because I'm singing that song in a house that by the standards of the late 1960s could only be called exotic. Plush oriental carpets, my grandmother's beautiful, intricate, ornate Armenian lacework everywhere, and floor-to-ceiling bookcases with books in a language, an alphabet, I could not begin to decipher. When my father started kindergarten at 5, he couldn't speak a word of English, and so he chose to reinvent himself, to become as American as he possibly could. In the 1950s, he became that most iconic of mid-20th century American business professionals, an ad man, a madman. Think Don Draper. That's how extensive his reinvention was. In 1988, he and my mother retired to South Florida. In 2009, long a widower and his health failing, I started to visit him every 3 or 4 weeks. I would check in with him, see how he was doing. If he felt up to it, hit a bucket of golf balls. And always we would look at the old family photographs, including this one. Oldest photograph in the Bohjalian family archives, a small city called Kayseri, end of the 19th century. The little boy on his father's lap, that's my grandfather, Levon Nazareth. My great-grandfather, Nazareth Bedros, he'll appear a little bit later. And we would look at the oldest photograph I have of my father. It is New York City, mid-1930s. I love this picture of my father and my grandparents. There's my dad with the big, wide ears, the short pants, a necktie that falls 3 inches above his navel. Standing behind him, my grandmother Heidrich, elegant gray-black dress, corsage the size of a softball. In my beautiful grandmother, I can see wisps of my beautiful 21-year-old daughter, Grace Experience. Sitting beside them, Levon Nazareth, my grandfather. He's wearing a suit. In my memories, he's always wearing a suit. I once asked his daughter, my Aunt Rosemary, I said, Aunt Rosemary, when you were a little girl, was Grandpa always wearing a suit? And she laughed and said, Chris, of course not. I remember one day when he was cleaning the oil burner, he took off his jacket. Levon and Heidrich were survivors of the Armenian Genocide. And like so many survivors, they took most of their stories to their graves. We know bits and pieces. We know that my grandmother, Heidrich Shadinian, her father provided cavalry horses to the Ottoman army and had for years. In 1915, rather than acquire the horses legally, they simply shot him to death, confiscated the horse farm, and for good measure, confiscated the Shadinian home. My grandfather, Levon, in 1915, he had 3 older brothers alive in Cairo. They were alive. Between 1915 and the mid-1920s, when my grandparents wed in Paris, all 3 brothers would be lost to the mists of history. We know nothing of what happened to this day, their death or their disappearance. There are 2 reasons why I wrote The Sandcastle Girls. First of all, because the story is so profoundly important. There's a direct link between the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, the Cambodian killing fields, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur. It's a very long list. Secondly, because today the Armenian Genocide has become, as my narrator Laura Petrosian calls it in my novel, the slaughter you know next to nothing about. Once upon a time, all North American eyes horror at the fraying edges of the Ottoman Empire. Everyone knew there were best-selling books leading Armenia, best-selling books, Armenian massacres, best-selling books, a memoir, Ravished Armenia, the story of Aurora Mardiganian, Aurora, an Armenian girl who survived the death marches into the deserts, emigrated to the US, and published her memoir that would also become a Hollywood blockbuster movie, 8 reels. Today, but 1 reel exists. You can see it at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, at the Genocide Museum in Yerevan, and even a few minutes on YouTube. The part you can see on YouTube, Hollywood's recreation of that moment from her memoir, when Aurora watched her mother and some of the women on the caravan stripped naked, nailed to wooden crosses, and crucified under the searing Syrian sun. The Armenian Genocide was the United States' first great humanitarian outreach effort. Near East Relief saved at least 130,000 Armenian children. The numbers, they are staggering. Here's the reality. In 1915, there were roughly 2 million Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire. By the end of the First World War, all but 500,000 would be dead, systematically annihilated by their own government, along with 300,000 Assyrians and a couple 100,000 Greeks. You will look at the lower right-hand corner here, and these are Ottoman census figures. You will see close to 400,000 Armenians. By 1924, that Ottoman census figure would be 60,000, all in what is today Istanbul, 0 across the rest of the country. The New York Times alone ran 154 articles, many off the front page about the Armenian Genocide, culminating with this 1919 story, the death sentence, and the conviction for crimes against humanity of the 3 architects of the genocide, Talat, Jamal, and Enver Pasha, by the first post-war Turkish government. Once upon a time, everyone knew. But the news cycles moved on. The fledgling nation-state of Armenia was subsumed by the Soviet Union. There was the Great Depression. There was the rise of Nazi Germany. And in 1923, there was the second post-war Turkish government, the Ataturk government, that began with Stalin-like fanaticism to rewrite history and to systematically deny the modern era's first genocide. This is an op-ed that I had in the Boston Globe earlier this month about Turkey's continued denial of the Armenian Genocide and the complicity of some of Turkey's allies in refusing to use the word genocide as if this were 1952 and we were still viewing Turkey as the last bastion against Soviet expansion. As a result, today, the Armenian story for most of North America exists only in ruins, and these are actual photographs I've taken in my travels throughout what is today eastern Turkey, but was once the Armenian homeland that Dana is going to share with you in some breathtaking images. The ruins of our monasteries, once the home of our reverend fathers, now the homes for seagull and graffiti. This is the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Beirut. You walk in and you are greeted by 3 glass windows behind which are but a homeopathic fragment of the skulls and the bones pulled from the sands of Deir Zor. Now, there are a lot of reasons why I wrote The Sandcastle Girls. I will share with you but 2. This is the Dudon crevasse, not far from Çankuş, in what is today southeastern Turkey. Here's what the history books said happened in 3 days in June of 1915. The 10,000 Armenians in the Çankuş area were marched there, shot, and their bodies thrown 350 feet into the bottom of the gorge. I paid my respects at the crevasse and then was leaving Çankuş when a Kurdish gentleman my age knocked on our van door and said, and there were 7 of us in the van, we had to meet his mother-in-law. She was 98 years old. We did the math. This was 2013. She was born in 1915. So we went to meet her. The history books were wrong. Not all of the Armenians died that day at Çankuş. One of the Kurdish executioners pulled from the line a young woman because she was so beautiful, and he married her. She had in her arms an infant daughter, and he raised her as his own. She's alive today. Asiya, the last living Armenian in Çankuş. And here's why this story matters to me. As my friend Hachig was interviewing her, she kept looking at all of us and saying, you're Armenian. You're Armenian. You're really Armenian. And that's when I got it. Her son is a good man. Her son-in-law is a good man. A very good man. It wasn't that he wanted us to meet her. He wanted her to meet us. To see that while she is the last living Armenian in Çankuş, the race continues. I returned last year in August with my family to see her. There's my wife and daughter with her. It was a glorious family reunion. I will see her again in June. And there's another reason why I wrote this book and why it matters to me. Remember this photograph? I said we'd come back to Nazareth. I grew up assuming that Nazareth was a tailor and he may have dabbled as a writer. That's what we learned. I came across an Armenian encyclopedia, and you will immediately recognize the man in that photograph. It's my great-grandfather, Nazareth. There are 5 pages about him in that encyclopedia. He wasn't a tailor who dabbled as a poet. He was a poet and troubadour. He was a prodigy who, at 13, was taken from Kayseri to perform in Jerusalem. For the next 2 decades, he would be performing as far west in Constantinople and as far southeast as Jerusalem. He was a rock star on the Anatolian plains in the 1870s, a troubadour singing his work. Very Walt Whitman-like celebrations of humankind. In 1896, his work changed. In a run-up to the Armenian genocide known as the Hamidian massacres, when Sultan Abdul Hamid II slaughtered 250,000 Armenians, his work changed. On November 18, 1895, the Hamidian massacres came to Kayseri, and Nazareth was a witness. He would write a 70-quatrain epic about what he saw. I will share with you but 2 of the quatrains. They killed infidels with axes, daggers, didn't ask who you were, whether merchant or coolie. They took the babies out of the wombs of their mothers, and those who witnessed lost their minds. I have always been so proud to be my father's son. I've always been so proud to be my grandfather's grandson. But it was only with this discovery that I've become so proud to be my great-grandfather's great son. Novelists talk with an agonizing amount of hubris about finding our voice. The fact is, I found my voice decades ago in a book called Water, which is set in part in this very building. But it is only with the Sandcastle Girls that I found my heart, and then my soul. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the lovely and talented and utterly amazing Dana Walrath.
Well, thank you, Chris, for the beautiful introduction to the Armenian Genocide, and for sharing your story about writing. It does bring tears to my eyes still to hear these things, even though I've heard many of them before. I want to thank, too, Senator Lenes and Representative Lenes and Representative Gresham and Senator Baruth and Snelling, who were our biggest champions in the House. I'm so proud to be a Vermonter today. What happened here today stands by the principle that Martin Luther King put out in his letter from Birmingham jail, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So the network of mutuality that he described in that letter, it's only become more potent today in an era of globalization. We're more mutually dependent than we ever were. And when it comes to true leadership, justice must always come before political exigency. Now, as a Vermont Armenian, I've had fellow citizens say to me things like, oh, this happened 100 years ago. Why can't Armenians just get over it? Why can't they just let it go? And so I wanted to start by explaining why we can't just let it go. First of all, by honoring the truth about the past, that's the only way that the whole world can move into a just future. Anthropologists like me, we study human diversity across space and time. So let's expand Dr. King's wisdom to take time into account and say that injustice, anytime, is a threat to justice always. I mean, can you imagine if we in the United States tried to say that we didn't, slavery didn't happen, that we didn't own that? Can you imagine if we pretended that American Indians didn't live here before the Europeans arrived? I mean, to be sure, the United States hasn't done all it should to right those wrongs, but at least our history books don't deny that these breaches happened. The second reason that the Armenian Genocide is relevant today is that this genocide is still ongoing in the following way. Genocide scholars talk about genocide in terms of a model of these phases. And here what you see is the model that Gregory Stanton first presented in a white paper to the State Department in 1996. Classification, separating people out into us and them. Symbolization, associating groups of people with a symbol like the Star of David. Dehumanization, making it so their personhood is stripped away, and then those people, because they're no longer human, they can be butchered, they can be treated like animals, they're no longer human. Then there's organization, polarization, preparation, which is putting everybody together in ghettos or marching them out into the desert. And then only then do you get to extermination, the actual killing. But the last phase is denial. And denial is always the last phase. It always happens. Every government that's perpetrated a genocide, every group that's perpetrated a genocide always says at first it didn't happen. And then it takes things like tribunals and reparations and apologies to finally end denial. So when we're talking about the Armenian Genocide, we're talking about a genocide that's still ongoing because we're still in this phase of denial. That fact has given tacit permission for all the other genocides that have taken place in the 20th century and into the 21st century. In the 20th century alone, 83 million people died in genocides, it's estimated, from the Holocaust to Cambodia, to Rwanda, to Bosnia, and beyond. So the Armenian Genocide is connected to all of today's global social justice issues, from Congo to Myanmar, to reparations to descendants of slaves in this country, to what's going on in the state of Syria right now. Now, as Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, has pointed out, the U.S. handling of the Armenian Genocide 100 years ago set up a series of pernicious patterns that disrupt the world today. But by doing what happened today, commemorating the Armenian Genocide, the Vermont legislature has taken a step towards mending that disruption. So thank you again. So that's what I can tell you as a professor, as an anthropologist, but I have more to tell you about the Armenian Genocide, and this time as a daughter, as a granddaughter, and as a writer. So I'm going to shift gears to a very different sort of a story. These are my grandparents. Yerishe and Oridat. There was an arranged marriage in New York, probably in borrowed clothes. This is my mother, Alice Mashoyan. She was born in New York City in 1933, the little one there. English was her not a language that she learned until she went off to kindergarten. Now, she always attributed her father's brooding spirit to the fact that he lost his wife and his sons in the genocide. In Vaughan. He had been a grown man there already. Now, he died when I was 6, so I never really knew him. Here he is with my baby sister. The story that I knew about him was that every night with a shot of cognac after dinner, he would curse the Enver Pasha, and then he would curse Christopher Columbus for discovering America. But then, when he went to Soviet Armenia in the early 1960s, apparently he dropped the Christopher Columbus. This is my mother's mother, my grandmother Oridat. She's there with 2 of her brothers, Haruchun and Vartan, and a sister-in-law. They met in the orphanage. And then Haruchun and Mariam's daughter, Rose. I never knew this grandmother. She died long before I was born. She was about 10 during the genocide. She was from Palu, as Chris mentioned, a town many kilometers from Aleppo where she ended up. And when I was about 10, I asked my mother, so, what was her childhood like? Now, this is, it was when I was 10. The Brady Bunch was on TV. And she said, oh, well, when her parents were killed, she and her brother, her younger brother and sister hid during the day and ran at night to the orphanage in Aleppo. And I didn't know what to think of that. I didn't know how to make sense of it, and I just kind of put it away. So there's a disjunction that happens between the generations. I didn't know her. I didn't know her story. I didn't know her language even. I had only things like scraps, like my mother drew out a family tree for us so I could understand the Trochagirians, my grandmother Oridat, and the relationship to the Providence relatives and the Buffalo relatives and so forth. But we have only scraps. That's something that descendants are left with. Now, Uncle Benny and Aunt Alice, they were colorful characters in my childhood. I had them both until I was about 17, 18 years old. But I didn't think to ask any of the important questions. It wasn't until much later, after everybody was gone. Now, what I didn't mention in here is, like Chris, I'm also a half Armenian. But I was half on the opposite side. My mother's Armenian. My father's American. I don't look Armenian. I don't even have an Armenian last name. My mother wanted us to grow up and succeed in the United States. She wanted us to be blonde, to leave the tragedy behind, to do all those good things. But nevertheless, something about Armenia was calling her. So in 1977, we went to the Caucasus. We went to visit our relatives in Yerevan. And I was enthralled. I was a teenager. It was amazing to see Echmiadzin and meet these relatives that I never knew I had. My mother, in the meantime, was pretty weighted down and worried and upset about all of the responsibility, and we left all of our possessions behind when we flew home. I went off to college, ready to really find my Armenian identity. I joined the Armenian Club at Columbia University. I filled my language requirement with Armenian. What else did I do? I mean, I was part of that world. It was going to be who I was. But gradually I realized I didn't quite fit in. Again, I was a mongrel, I was a half-breed. I was there with young Armenian Americans who were struggling to hold on to their identity. And to them, I was other. I was outside of that. Around that time, my mother cut off ties with the Armenian relatives. She was overwhelmed by the responsibility. And so I went on like my mother before me. I married a wonderful American guy. He played the oud upstairs earlier today. But still, Armenia was calling. So in 1984, we took a trip to Western Armenia, to Eastern Turkey. We had a great disguise, a couple of American kids. And I kept it quiet the whole time I was there. We were just Americans. We would go and visit churches, and you could see all the faces were always, defaced and removed and vandalized. We wouldn't tell people when we'd go to their house, like this very friendly family in Mush invited us in, and they fed us all the foods I had grown up eating. And kept on saying, oh, I bet you've never tasted anything like this before. And I said, no, it's delicious, but it was exactly what I grew up eating. I only revealed my identity twice. The first time was in Kars, and it was to this young man here. Kars is the city right near the ancient capital of Armenia, Ani. And we were standing outside the abandoned Armenian church there. It's all sandbagged and surrounded by barricades. And this guy started agitating and saying, that's an Armenian church. You know Ani in Turkish is an Armenian capital. And I realized, he has to be Armenian. And so I said to him, are you Armenian? And he said, yeah. And then I was explaining my mother is Armenian, my father's American. And he took my Turkish-English dictionary and started paging through it and then he was delighted when he could show me the word that explained exactly who I was, and it was mongrel. I shared who I was a few weeks later. We had made our way from there down to Palu, and we approached the city of Palu via the church. So this is the church that my grandmother must have prayed in growing up. It's high up on a hill, and it's been obviously destroyed and abandoned. We made our way into town, and we started asking people. We learned some Turkish for the trip. I mean, we were out there. This was before Turkey was a nice eco-adventure tourist destination, and it was a time that Armenians couldn't travel in Turkey safely at all, the way we could. But we started asking people, hey, are there any mills nearby? And we were sent across a bridge that got built to replace this one, on which many, many killings happened during the genocide, and down along the side of the river, up past a fast-flowing stream, till we got to a mill. And then at the mill, the lady of the house invited us upstairs and served us tea. That's all of them. This picture wasn't good quality, but I had to show you. I really was there. She served us tea in clear glass cups, and all of these children with big brown eyes, just like my little sister, were watching the whole time. And I asked her about the history of the mill, and she explained that it had been in her family for about 60 years. I was there in 1984. And then she paused for a minute, and she said, but before that, it belonged to Armenians. We looked at each other for a moment as the water hit the mill wheel and the stones on the stream, and for that one moment, that Turkish official policy of denial evaporated. I went on, many years later, 25 years later, to start writing the book, Like Water on Stone, a story of 3 siblings who, after their parents are killed, hide during the day and run at night from Palu to Aleppo. They had the benefit of a guardian spirit of an eagle, and this is the eagle from Gerhard in Armenia. As I wrote, I had my memories of Palu, of the green color of the eastern branch of the Euphrates River, of the pink mountain sides. I remember the apricots drying on the roof. I remembered the destroyed church. From being in Turkey that summer, I also knew what it was like to be part of the hated other. It was summer of '84, summer of the Los Angeles Olympics, the summer that the Armenian radical group, the Asala, got turned to violence, PLO style. And they had made threats to the Turkish Olympic team and so forth. And so every day, every time we saw a newspaper, there was an anti-Armenian story in it. So I knew what it was like to be the hated mother, but hated other. But I also knew what it was like, how dangerous that is. How if, as soon as we start to write people up as us and them, that can quickly turn into genocide. So I tried every day to not make that be a part of the novel. I was lucky enough to be finishing the novel while I was living in Armenia. I was there as a Fulbright scholar. And I was working on a project so that I got to be with old people every single day. You know, we ate many meals together in soup kitchens. There they were at political rallies, or we're talking about something, or I visited them at their homes. They spontaneously shared their stories with me, oftentimes just stories of their families in the genocide. They shared all the medicinal remedies with me. They gave me recipes. I had grandparents for the first time in my life, many, many, many grandparents. I also got a chance to make connections, to reestablish the connections with the Armenian cousins. Sarkis, this brother, ended up in Yerevan, and now his great-granddaughter is leading a team at Tumo in Armenia who's making an animation of my book, Like Water on Stone. And this isn't that animation, but this is her previous animation, because that one, no one gets to see it till April 21st, which we're excited about. Every time I needed to do more research at the Genocide Museum and Institute, I could walk there, which is something that Armenians do every April 24th. Thousands, tens of thousands. This year it's going to be hundreds of thousands of people walk up to this memorial and lay flowers there. And they do this to honor all the footsteps of the people who walked out to Deir Zor, into the desert. And it just felt like I couldn't take a bus or a cab. I had to walk there every time. Now, one place I didn't go while I was there as a Fulbright scholar was to Nagorno-Karabakh. This is a fledgling republic, fledgling state rather, that was part of the Soviet Republic, Azerbaijan, but when the Soviet Union was dissolving, they became an independent state. I was in Armenia as a Fulbright scholar, so technically I was an employee of the State Department. So I was told I could not go there, and I wasn't going to violate that rule. But you better believe that the next fall, when I came back as an independent citizen, I went right there. And this is one of the beautiful churches there. And I know that the Vermont legislature tried to pass a resolution relating to Nagorno-Karabakh last year. And I just want to tell you what I experienced when I was there, because it made me sad that couldn't progress, and I want to provide a little bit of context of my experience. This is a mosque in Shushi, a beautiful historic trading city. The mosques that are part of Shushi still stand. Nobody's torn them down. And this fledgling government with very little money, I mean, it's landlocked, it's got no diplomatic relationships with almost anybody. They're making sure that our culture stays. And I know that there are legislators in this room, and you know how important things like that are. You know that also, here's the road driving into Shushi. This road goes right through an Armenian cemetery. This photograph here is what you look out to from the side of that road. And as legislators, you also know that we're required in the United States by law to protect archaeology from any kind of building. And that's not just something we do in the United States. From Colombia to Chile to China, most countries in the world protect and honor burial grounds and historical and prehistoric treasures. It's part of our collective cultural humanity. That was not happening in this part of the world. That is part of why Nagorno-Karabakh needed independence. So it was It wasn't possible to live there. And I hope that this gets revisited in the Vermont State House, because it will be a contribution to peace in the future. We're used to thinking of boundaries, national boundaries, as things that are sacrosanct. You know, we've had our country's boundaries for over 200 years. Well, when you think about the former Soviet Union, you have to first remember that Stalin drew up all of those republics according to a philosophy of divide and conquer. He took the ethnic mix and then kind of made sure that he had every republic filled with different people who would be fighting against one another, so that nationalism would never override the primacy of the Soviet Union. Those republics that remained are now in turmoil, from Georgia to the Ukraine to Nagorno-Karabakh. They are feeling the bloody legacy of Stalin. And instead, what we want is to tap back into the things that can be true and good in this world. And that's why I wanted to write the book that I wrote, why I wanted to write a story that would talk about the Armenian genocide in a way that students could read about it, adults could read about it, teachers could read about it, and it wouldn't necessarily demonize the Turkish position, because as a novelist, believe it or not, the most important thing to me is the truth. But when I talk about truth, it's a different sort of truth. It's not necessarily just facts, though when you're writing historical fiction, you've got to get all your facts straight. The kind of truth that I care about is the kind of truth that William James, spoke about when he said that the ultimate test for us of what a truth means is the conduct that it dictates or inspires. And I think that what happened here today was that kind of truth. And for that, I'm absolutely filled with gratitude. Now, in the end, I realize I'm not really very different from any of you in this room. I recognize myself as a blend of ethnic groups, a mix of sorts. And there I am with 2 of my kids in Armenia. My mother, a biology teacher, sometimes she would pat me on the head. And she would say that I had hybrid vigor, as though I was some kind of new disease-resistant strain of apple or squash or pomegranate. But my time in Armenia taught me that the true strength of my mongrel nature is more cultural than biological. Because as a half-breed, I was as affected by the US Civil Rights Movement as I was by the genocide survival stories that I inherited. Together, those things make me look for the common humanity, as well as the accurate recognition of history. And they make me see that kind of truth as the road to peace. So thank you.
We've actually got time for a couple of questions. If any of you have questions for Dana, that was extraordinary and wonderful and perfect, or anyone in the room.
Yeah.
And the first question is always the hardest for you and for us. David, so read to a writer, a gifted Montpelier writer.
So for both of you, this sounded like this was a launching on these books was, there was a long sort of maybe unknown incubation beforehand. Chris is not none. Was there a crystallizing thing that made you decide, I've got to write this book now? As opposed to saying, kind of connecting with your heritage, which you went into very nicely.
It's writing a dissertation in anthropology made me start thinking about creative writing, believe it or not. But that's how that evolved. And then I started, I was writing in snatches and working on many, many projects at once. And in fact, I have a bunch of other novels that are along in various stages, and hopefully will be back in my editor's hands very soon. But this one was the one that was finished first, and I think it must have been the forces of nature, just making sure that it got finished for now, because we need the book now. And my other stories, they can come out later. So.
It did have a long gestation. The Sandcastle Girls also had a long gestation period. The first time I tried to write a novel of the Armenian Genocide was back in 1993 and 1994, where the entire manuscript, 392 pages, when I finished reading it, I saw it was an absolute train wreck, unpublishable. It was a young Armenian-American novelist's cathartic fury, but it wasn't a book. So I decided instead to write this book about a midwife on trial, and that worked out well. I tried again, precisely because the story is so profoundly important, and because my father's health was failing. In a perfect world, my father would have been alive when this book was published. Sadly, he was not.
Thanks.
I have a question that has to do with acknowledgement. During the Soviet period, did Moscow acknowledge the Armenian genocide?
Oh, that's...
I'm a Ukrainian immigrant interested in the Holodomor, so.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. At first, no. And then at the 50th anniversary of the genocide, Armenians started protesting and insisting that there be some form of recognition. And that's when that memorial was built. So you saw those funny pictures of us in 1977 with all the relatives around the same memorial. So there was a political movement that made Moscow give Armenia a little bit of slack. Some of that happened because of the fact that within the Soviet Union, Armenia was a great vacation spot for the politicians of Moscow, and had the best climate, the best fruit, it was the place to go in summer. So they were a little more tolerant of Armenian nationalism than they were of, say, Ukrainian nationalism. I remember in 1977 going right from Yerevan to Odessa, where we had some cousins, and just being dumbfounded that we were eating the most delicious foods in Yerevan, and in Odessa people were standing on line to get a potato, and that was it. So I think there was a little favoritism there for Armenia.
Partly, I asked that question because in 31-32, as you know, 6 to 10 million people were
Yes.
killed by Stalin in Ukraine. And that's never been acknowledged
Yeah.
formally. So I'm just curious as to the legal process.
You will see more acknowledgement of that, I think, this coming year, thanks again to fiction
Yes.
and Thomas Rob Smith's novel, Child 44, which becomes a major film. And I think that's going to awaken a lot of people's eyes to the cataclysm that was the Ukraine in the early 1930s.
I think, Stalin is responsible for a huge number of those 83 million deaths in the 20th century, and probably even worse than Hitler, and we don't really have that out in public yet. It does, and fiction is going to
A
do
good book to read, if anyone's interested, is called Blood Lens by Timothy Snyder from Yale.
Oh, great.
It's a couple of years old, but it's well worth a read.
Thank you. Yeah.
Both of you alluded to other genocides and the larger umbrella. Is there any kind of movement or organization just dealing with genocide per se, as opposed, because what I'm thinking of, and also talking about losing your heritage.
Yeah.
I'm of Irish ancestry, but you wouldn't know it.
Right.
You really wouldn't. My ancestors were dead set that that was the past and this is the future. So this is not Irish national, but the potato famine was not a natural disaster. It was, first of all, it was global. It only caused starvation in Ireland. It was a policy.
Right.
And so, and it's rarely spoken of as genocide, even though it was, because the English are our allies and we don't want to accuse them. So what is going on about genocide?
Look, there's something called the International Association of Genocide Scholars, a group of historians who quite literally categorize what constitutes a genocide and what does not constitute a genocide. So whenever somebody says to you, oh, the Armenian genocide, it's a he said, she said issue, it's not a he said, she said issue any more than global climate change is a he said, she said issue. The International Association of Genocide Scholars have categorized it as genocide. As for the Irish potato famine, I honestly don't know whether they've categorized it as genocide, but I'd like to believe they have. Do you know the answer to that?
I do know that it's very widely thought of as a problem of structural violence and real discrimination and so forth. And I'll look and see about that. That's interesting. And to add to what Chris said about the International Association of Genocide Scholars, a very accessible way to tap right into is the organization called Genocide Watch. That is a number of genocide scholars who just really keep it out there and alive on the internet, and you can read white papers and see what's happening, what countries, what stage of genocide they're in right now, because the idea is if we're talking about it, we can prevent it, because every single one of those stages has a way of it being prevented, and we should reckon with the potato famine.
Do you see any connection or direct connection between the Armenian genocide and what's going on now in Syria, Iraq with ISIS?
Yes.
And obliteration of the Assyrian, Armenian, Arab heritage?
The question is about any connection between the Armenian genocide and the cataclysm that has engulfed Syria and Iraq via ISIS, beginning with the Syrian civil war in early 2011. Absolutely. For those of you who read The Sandcastle Girls, you know at the epilogue, Laura Petrosian journeys to Deir el-Zor to go to the Armenian church there and the Armenian Genocide Memorial there with the massive, hauntingly beautiful column of resurrection, which includes the bones pulled from the sands of Deir el-Zor. In September of last year, that church and the column of resurrection were not merely blown up in fighting, they were systematically dynamited. Dana talked eloquently about the last stage in a genocide is denial. It's not simply enough to ethnically cleanse a people from a geography. You need to ethnically cleanse any trace that they were there, including their churches, their monuments, their museums. You want to eliminate any trace. And certainly, the Armenian community has been absolutely devastated in the Syrian civil war and wherever ISIS is in northern Iraq. Last month, the Norwegian edition of the Sandcastle Girls was published. It's called Sandcastles in Aleppo, and it might be the most haunting of all the international edition covers because it's a beautiful photograph of Aleppo. And that Aleppo's gone. That Aleppo exists now only in the pages of books and histories.
And to take it to an even more sort of policy level, that ties right back into Samantha Power's idea. I mean, that whole region especially is hurting because we've got a series of borders that were drawn, we've got a series of governments that were in charge globally, the big colonial powers who didn't do the right thing. And if you don't do the right thing, it eventually comes back and bites you, and that's why there's such political unrest. So it's true that ISIS right now is doing horrible things, but other governments are complicit in having created such disruption by not making sure that we dealt with the sins of the past properly.
The Armenians and the Assyrians had large communities throughout places like Beirut, Aleppo, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, because that's where the Western missionaries rounded up the orphans and tried to save them. And as a result, there are large Armenian communities, large Assyrian communities throughout the Middle East that are now being absolutely obliterated. It is horrific and nightmarish.
We have one more question.
We have to go out to Palm Desert, California every year. And in Palm Desert, there's a Holocaust museum. I'm sorry? Tolerance Museum. And it's on a little portion of the desert just outside. And there is the most magnificent display of the history of the Armenian people there. Absolutely gorgeous. And their Holocaust.
I haven't been there. I'm going to be in California next year, and I'm going to make sure I'll be there in July. Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. It really is.
Thank you. There's more food. Thank you. There is more food. This would not be an Armenian gathering if there was not food. There's more food. So thank you again.